Hey everyone, welcome to the human side of hospitals. I'm so glad you are here. And now on this channel, we don't just talk about medicine, we listen to real people, to patients, to doctors, nurses, caregivers, anyone who has an unforgettable hospital experience. The hospitals can be places of healing, hope, sometimes even heartbreak, and every story has something to teach us. That is why I'm starting this, just to give people a space to share, to be heard, and to remind us that behind every hospital wall are human beings with stories worth telling. Now, here's where you come in. So, if you've ever been a patient, if you've worked in a hospital, or if you've supported a loved one through their hospital journey, I would love to hear from you. And you can send me a short video, audio, just write your story down. Or if you would like to sit and chat with me, you can join me live on Zoom. And all you have to do is just fill the form in the description below, or you can send me an email. And it doesn't matter where you are from, who you are, or whatsoever. You are welcome wherever part of the world you come from. And before we dive in, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn the notification bell. Basically, not to miss these incredible voices from around the world. And a quick disclaimer before we start: these stories, their personal stories, shared with full consent, and we are here just to inspire, educate, and raise awareness. One thing is those who want to remain anonymous online, well, for the sake of confidentiality and privacy, altered some of their voices into AI voices. And note that even the advice shared in these videos or in these experiences, they are not a substitute for medical advice. Always remember this. And if you have health concerns, always speak to a qualified healthcare professional. All right, let's dive into today's story.
I've spent 14 years working hospital security at Mercy General in Buffalo, New York. Started as a patrol officer straight out of community college. Worked my way up to shift supervisor for the graveyard rotation. I've got certifications in crisis intervention, de-escalation techniques, and emergency response protocols. I've restrained combative patients high on PCP, talked down suicidal teens in the ER, and handled everything from domestic disputes spilling into our lobby to gang members trying to finish what they started on the street. In all those years, I thought I'd seen the absolute worst of humanity. Overdoses, stabbings, child abuse cases that made me question whether there's any good left in this world. But I maintained my professional composure because that's what the job demanded. Hospital security isn't like mall cops or parking lot patrols. We're the thin line between chaos and the medical staff trying to save lives. We carry radios, not weapons, but we're trained to handle situations that would send most people running. Mercy General is a level 1 trauma center serving Western New York, a sprawling complex of interconnected buildings that's grown organically over the past century. The original brick structure from 1923 sits at the center, surrounded by newer wings and towers added decade by decade. The basement levels contain the morgue, storage, and maintenance tunnels that snake beneath the entire facility like concrete arteries. During night shifts, those corridors echo with the distant hum of HVAC systems and the occasional rattle of supply carts being wheeled to their destinations. I love the night shift because it let me really know the building. You learn every sound, every shadow, every door that doesn't quite close right. The emergency department never sleeps, but most of the hospital settles into a quieter rhythm after midnight. That familiarity, that sense of complete control over my environment, is what made what happened on March 15th, 2023, so fundamentally impossible to accept. That was the night that destroyed everything I thought I understood about my job, my building, and maybe reality itself. It started like any other Tuesday night. I clocked in at 11:47 p.m., relieving Martinez from the day shift. The overnight crew consisted of myself, Thompson on patrol, and Kowalski monitoring the security office. Standard staffing for a Tuesday. Enough to handle typical issues, but not the chaos of a weekend night. I made my initial rounds checking the ED waiting room, main lobby, and the restricted access points on floors 2 through 7. At 1:23 a.m., I got a call from Nurse Rodriguez in the ICU on the 4th floor. Patient in room 412 was being disruptive. Nothing violent, just refusing to stay in bed and trying to walk around despite being connected to multiple monitoring devices. Standard procedure was to assess whether we needed to implement soft restraints or a verbal de-escalation would suffice. I took the elevator up, badging through the ICU security door with my access card. The ICU at night has its own atmosphere. Dim lighting, the constant beeping of monitors, and that antiseptic smell that seems stronger when the building is quiet. Rodriguez met me at the nurse's station, a competent professional I'd worked with dozens of times over the years. Room 412, James Whitmore, admitted yesterday with chest pains. She briefed me. 73 years old, stable condition, but he keeps getting up and wandering around. Won't listen to staff instructions. We've explained the fall risk multiple times, but he's insisting he needs to check on something down the hall. I approach room 412 expecting the usual confused elderly patient, maybe dealing with hospital delirium or medication side effects. Instead, I found a thin man with silver hair sitting calmly on the edge of his bed, fully alert and oriented. He was wearing the standard hospital gown, connected to a cardiac monitor and IV line, but his demeanor was completely lucid. Mr. Whitmore, I'm Officer Collins with Hospital Security, I introduced myself. I understand you've been having trouble staying in bed tonight. He looked at me with clear, intelligent eyes. Officer, I need to check on the patient in room 418. She's in distress. Sir, room 418 is just down the hall. The nursing staff is monitoring all patients. Your job right now is to focus on your own recovery. You don't understand, he said, standing up despite the tangle of wires. She's calling for help, but no one can hear her. I can hear her through the walls. I exchanged a glance with Rodriguez, who shrugged. Auditory hallucinations weren't uncommon in hospital patients, especially elderly ones dealing with the stress of admission and unfamiliar medication regimens. But as I prepared to guide Mr. Whitmore back to bed, something made me pause. The ICU was designed with thick walls for patient privacy and noise control. Room 418 was 3 doors down and across the hall. Even with exceptional hearing, it would be impossible to distinguish sounds from that specific room, especially with the ambient noise of medical equipment. Mr. Whitmore, what exactly are you hearing? She's saying, please help me, I can't breathe, over and over. She's been saying it for the past 20 minutes. Rodriguez checked her tablet. Room 418 is Mrs. Chen, post-surgical recovery from gallbladder removal. She's been stable all night, sleeping soundly. I checked on her 15 minutes ago. But something about Mr. Whitmore's certainty bothered me. In 14 years, I'd learned to distinguish between confusion and genuine distress. This man wasn't exhibiting any signs of delirium or psychiatric disturbance. He was calm, articulate, and completely convinced of what he was experiencing. Let's walk down there together, I suggested, just to check. We made it 3 steps down the hallway before the code blue alarm started blaring. Room 418. The next few minutes were controlled chaos. The crash team descended on room 418, finding Mrs. Chen in severe respiratory distress. Her airway had become compromised due to an unexpected allergic reaction to post-operative medication. Without immediate intervention, she would have died. The timestamp on the code blue call was 1:41 a.m. According to the nursing notes, Mrs. Chen's last vitals check had been at 1:25 a.m., showing normal oxygen saturation and respiratory patterns. The medication that caused the reaction had been administered at 1:30 a.m. Mr. Whitmore had first mentioned hearing her distress at approximately 1:38 a.m. There was no medical explanation for how he could have known. Mrs. Chen's room was equipped with a call button, but she hadn't pressed it. The allergic reaction had developed too quickly for her to reach it. The walls between ICU rooms were constructed with sound-dampening materials specifically designed to prevent noise transfer. Even if she had been calling out, which the medical evidence suggested she couldn't have been doing due to airway constriction, the sound wouldn't have traveled to room 412. Dr. Martinez, the attending physician, pulled me aside after the emergency was resolved. That was excellent timing, he said. Another 5 minutes and we would have lost her. How did you know to check on her? I explained about Mr. Whitmore's insistence that he could hear her calling for help. Dr. Martinez frowned, checking the timeline in his notes. That's not possible, he said. The reaction timeline doesn't support it. She would have been unconscious within minutes of onset. There's no way she could have been calling out for 20 minutes. But Mr. Whitmore had been specific about the duration. He told me she'd been calling for help for 20 minutes before I arrived at his room. That would place the onset of her distress at approximately 1:20 a.m., 10 minutes before the medication was even administered. I returned to room 412 to follow up with Mr. Whitmore, expecting to find him confused or unable to explain what had happened. Instead, he was sitting quietly in bed, his cardiac monitor showing completely normal rhythms. "Is she going to be okay?" he asked. "Yes, sir. Thanks to you, actually. The medical team was able to respond quickly." He nodded, seeming unsurprised. "I'm glad." The sound stopped about 5 minutes ago when the doctors arrived. "Mr. Whitmore, can you explain to me what you heard exactly?" A woman's voice saying, "Please help me, I can't breathe." It was very clear, like she was speaking directly to me. It started around 1:20, maybe 1:25. Consistent, every few seconds getting more desperate. The timeline he provided was medically impossible. But Mrs. Chen was alive because of information that, according to every professional standard I knew, he couldn't have possessed. I spent the rest of my shift trying to rationalize what had happened. Maybe Mr. Whitmore had exceptional hearing. Maybe the hospital's acoustic design had some flaw that allowed sound to travel in unexpected ways. Maybe it was just an incredible coincidence. He'd imagined hearing distress calls, and coincidentally, there actually was a patient in distress. But none of those explanations felt adequate. I'd worked in this building for 14 years. I knew its construction, its sound patterns, its normal rhythms. What Mr. Whitmore described was impossible. 3 weeks later, I encountered the second case. April 7, 2023, 2:15 a.m. I was called to the emergency department for a psychiatric evaluation. The patient, Maria Santos, had been brought in by police after neighbors reported her standing in her apartment building's hallway, knocking on doors and insisting that someone in the building was dying alone and needed help. The responding officers found no evidence of anyone in distress. All residents were accounted for and safe. Ms. Santos had no history of psychiatric illness, no substances in her system, and no apparent trigger for the episode. She was a 34-year-old elementary school teacher with no prior law enforcement contact. Dr. Patel and the ED wanted a security presence during the evaluation because Ms. Santos was becoming increasingly agitated, not with aggression, but with what appeared to be genuine distress over her inability to make anyone understand her concern. "There's an elderly man in apartment 3B, she told Dr. Patel for the third time. "He's having chest pains. He's trying to call for help, but he can't reach his phone. He's saying, 'Someone please help me,' over and over." I listened to this exchange with growing unease. The specificity of her description, the clarity of her conviction, and her obvious distress over not being believed reminded me too much of Mr. Whitmore. Dr. Patel was patient, but clearly skeptical. "Ms. Santos, the police checked every apartment in your building. They spoke with the resident of 3B, Mr. Kowalski, and he was fine. He answered his door and confirmed he was in good health." "That was 2 hours ago," she insisted. "This is happening now. He needs help now." The timeline didn't make sense. According to the police report, they'd completed their check of the building at 1:30 a.m. Ms. Santos had been transported to our ED at 1:45 a.m. It was now 2:15 a.m., and she was claiming to still hear someone in distress from a location 8 miles away. But something about her certainty made me pick up my radio and contact dispatch. "This is Collins at Mercy General. Can you have a unit do a welfare check on apartment 3B at..." I looked at the address in the police report. 1247 Elmwood Avenue. Resident name Kowalski. Dr. Patel looked at me skeptically, but I'd learned to trust my instincts about people. Ms. Santos wasn't exhibiting signs of psychosis or substance abuse. She was experiencing genuine distress over something she believed was real. The radio crackled back 12 minutes later. "Collins, this is Unit 47. We've got an ambulance en route to that address. Elderly male resident found unconscious in his apartment, Appears to be cardiac event. How did you know? The room went silent. Dr. Patel stared at me, then at Miss Santos, who had slumped back in her chair with relief. Thank God, she whispered. I thought no one would listen. I asked the follow-up question I was dreading. Miss Santos, can you still hear him? No, she said. It stopped when the paramedics arrived. He's not alone anymore. The official report from the paramedics indicated that Mr. Kowalski had suffered a heart attack at approximately 2:20 a.m. He was found on his living room floor, his phone on a table just out of reach. Without emergency intervention, he would have died alone in his apartment. Ms. Santos had reported hearing his distress calls from 8 miles away, through multiple walls and floors, while he was physically unable to make any sound due to cardiac arrest. Dr. Patel discharged her with a recommendation for outpatient psychiatric evaluation, but I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. There was no medical framework for what had just happened. I started documenting everything, every detail, every timeline, every impossible element of both cases. I researched acoustic phenomena, psychological conditions, and any scientific explanation that might account for what I'd witnessed. The cases shared specific elements. Both patients reported hearing distress calls from people who were medically incapable of making those calls. Both provided accurate information about the timing and nature of medical emergencies they had no way of knowing about. Both described the voices stopping once emergency responders arrived. I began paying closer attention during my shifts, listening for other reports that might fit the pattern. The hospital staff started to notice my unusual interest in cases involving patients who claimed to hear things others couldn't. On May 2nd, I found the third case. David Kim, a 41-year-old accountant, was admitted to our psychiatric ward after his family reported that he'd become convinced he could hear his deceased father calling for help. Mr. Kim had been sleeping poorly for weeks, insisting that his father was trapped somewhere and needed assistance. The family was understandably concerned. Mr. Kim's father had died 6 months earlier from complications following surgery at a different hospital across town. There was no rational basis for his claims, but when I read the intake notes more carefully, I noticed details that made my blood run cold. Mr. Kim reported that the calls for help had started on April 30th at approximately 3 a.m. He described his father's voice as saying, "Help me, I can't get out," repeatedly for several hours before stopping. I pulled the records from St. Mary's Hospital where Mr. Kim's father had died. On April 30th, 2023, at 2:47 a.m., there had been a power failure in the morgue's refrigeration system. By morning, the backup generators had restored power, but the temperature logs showed a critical failure lasting several hours. Mr. Kim had reported hearing his father's distress at the exact time the morgue system failed, from a location 15 miles away, concerning a father who had been deceased for 6 months. I sat in my car after that shift, staring at my documentation. 3 cases, each medically and physically impossible, each involving accurate information that the patients had no way of possessing. I was a security guard trained in crisis intervention and emergency response, not a researcher or medical professional, but I couldn't ignore the pattern. The breaking point came on June 18, 2023. I was working an overtime shift, covering for Thompson, who'd called in sick. At 3:22 a.m., I received a call from the pediatric ICU on the 6th floor. A 12-year-old patient, Emma Rodriguez, was crying and refusing to sleep, insisting that the baby is scared and wants her mommy. The pediatric ICU housed critically ill children, and it wasn't uncommon for young patients to experience anxiety or confusion. I expected to provide reassurance and perhaps help coordinate with family members or child life specialists. But when I arrived, I found Emma sitting up in her bed, connected to monitors for her treatment of severe asthma, pointing toward the wall that separated the pediatric intensive care unit from the neonatal intensive care unit. "She's right there," Emma said, pointing at the wall. "The little baby. She's crying because she can't find her mommy." Nurse Williams, a veteran pediatric nurse I'd worked with for years, pulled me aside. She's been doing this for about 30 minutes, very specific about the location and the nature of the distress. "We've explained that there's a wall there, that she can't possibly hear anything from the other unit, but she's adamant." "What's on the other side of that wall?" I asked. "In an NICU bed 7, Williams replied. but I checked with the NICU staff 20 minutes ago. That bed currently houses a premature infant who's been stable all night, sleeping peacefully according to their notes. I looked at Emma, who was still pointing at the exact same spot on the wall. In my experience with children, their attention spans for imaginary concerns were limited, but Emma's focus was unwavering, and her distress was clearly genuine. Emma, what is the baby saying? She's not saying words. She's just crying because she's scared and she wants her mommy. Her mommy isn't there, and she doesn't understand why. Something about the specificity of that statement bothered me. I radioed down to the NICU and asked to speak with their charge nurse. This is Collins in security. Can you give me a status update on the infant in bed 7? Bed 7, let me check. Baby girl Johnson, 32 weeks gestational age, admitted 3 days ago. Currently stable, sleeping. Where are the parents? There was a pause. Mother is recovering from an emergency cesarean section at another hospital. Father is with her. They haven't been able to visit yet due to complications with the mother's recovery. So the infant was alone, separated from her mother due to circumstances beyond anyone's control. But that didn't explain how Emma could know about the situation or the specific emotional content of the baby's distress. One more question, I said. What time was the baby's last feeding? She's been sleeping since about 2:30 a.m., due for her next feeding at 4 a.m. I checked my watch. 3:47 a.m. If the infant was sleeping peacefully as reported, there was no basis for Emma's claims about crying or distress. But as I was ending the radio conversation, the NICU nurse's voice came back on, sounding puzzled. Collins, this is strange. The baby just started crying, and she seems unusually distressed. We're going to check on her now. Emma immediately relaxed in her bed. She stopped crying. Someone's coming to help her. The NICU team found that baby Johnson had somehow become tangled in her blankets in a way that was causing mild respiratory distress. It wasn't life-threatening, but it was causing discomfort that manifested as the crying the nurses had just begun to hear. Emma had reported the baby's distress 25 minutes before it became audibly apparent to the medical staff in the same room as the infant. I requested a meeting with hospital administration the following week. Dr. Rebecca Foster, Chief Medical Officer, and James Patterson, Director of Security Operations, listened to my documentation of the 4 cases with professional skepticism that gradually shifted to genuine concern. Officer Collins, Dr. Foster said after I'd finished, what you're describing challenges fundamental assumptions about sensory perception and medical monitoring. These cases seem to suggest that certain patients are somehow aware of medical distresses they couldn't possibly know about. That's exactly what I'm saying, I replied. And I think there may be more cases that haven't been properly documented because staff are dismissing them as psychiatric symptoms or hallucinations. Patterson leaned forward. What are you proposing? I think we need to start taking these reports seriously. When a patient claims to be hearing distress calls, especially if they can provide specific details about location or timing, we should investigate immediately rather than assuming it's delusional. Dr. Foster was quiet for a long moment. The medical implications of what you're suggesting are significant. You're talking about some form of extrasensory awareness of medical emergencies. There's no scientific framework for that. I'm not trying to provide a scientific framework, he said. I'm reporting what I've observed and suggesting that we develop protocols to respond to it. The meeting ended with a commitment to review the cases more thoroughly and consider developing new assessment protocols. But I could see the skepticism in their eyes. What I was proposing challenged everything they learned about medicine and human physiology. 2 weeks later, Patterson called me into his office. Collins, I've reviewed your cases with our legal department and medical staff. While we appreciate your attention to detail and your concern for patient safety, we're concerned that you may be developing an unhealthy fixation on these incidents. Sir, these patients provided accurate information about medical emergencies they had no way of knowing about. That's not a fixation. That's documentation of fact. The legal department is concerned about liability if we start treating unsubstantiated patient claims as emergency protocols. If we respond to every report of someone hearing voices, we'll overwhelm our emergency response capabilities. I realized that the institution couldn't afford to acknowledge what I documented. The implications were too far-reaching, too disruptive to standard medical practice. They needed to classify my observations as a security officer, becoming overly invested in coincidental events. Additionally, Patterson continued, some staff members have expressed concern that you're encouraging psychiatric patients to elaborate on their delusions by taking their claims seriously. Dr. Chen in psychiatry feels that your approach may be interfering with proper treatment. That was the moment I realized my career was over. Not because I'd done anything wrong, but because I documented something that the institution couldn't accept or integrate into its operational framework. I submitted my resignation on August 15, 2023. 14 years of experience, excellent performance reviews, commendations for emergency response, and a spotless record meant nothing when weighed against my insistence that certain patients were demonstrating capabilities that medical science couldn't explain. In my final report, I documented 12 additional cases I'd identified through careful review of incident reports and psychiatric consultations. Patients who claimed to hear distress calls, who provided specific information about medical emergencies, who exhibited distress that corresponded to actual events they couldn't have known about. The pattern was consistent. Patients with no history of psychiatric illness suddenly reporting that they could hear calls for help from specific locations. The calls always involved someone in genuine medical distress. The patients always provided accurate information about timing and nature of the emergency. The voices always stopped when emergency responders arrived. I tried to research similar phenomena in medical literature, but there was nothing. No studies, no case reports, no framework for understanding what I'd observed. It was as if I documented something that wasn't supposed to exist. My last shift was a quiet Tuesday night, the same shift rotation where I'd first encountered Mr. Whitmore. I walked through the familiar corridors, badged through the security doors I'd accessed thousands of times, and tried to reconcile my 14 years of experience with the knowledge that I was leaving because I'd paid attention to details that others preferred to ignore. As I cleaned out my locker, I wondered how many other cases had been dismissed as psychiatric symptoms or coincidental events. How many patients had provided accurate information about medical emergencies only to be sedated or transferred to psychiatric evaluation because their claims were medically impossible? The hardest part was accepting that I'd never have answers. I was a security guard who'd stumbled onto something that challenged fundamental assumptions about human perception and medical monitoring. I didn't have the credentials or institutional support to investigate further, but I couldn't stop thinking about the patients who trusted me with their impossible knowledge. Mr. Whitmore calmly insisting he could hear Mrs. Chen's distress through soundproof walls. Miss Santos desperate to make someone believe that an elderly man 8 miles away needed help. Emma pointing at a wall and providing emotional details about an infant's distress that she couldn't possibly have known. They weren't delusional. They weren't seeking attention. They were experiencing something real that happened to be impossible according to everything I'd been trained to understand about reality. 6 months after my resignation, I received a call from Rodriguez, the ICU nurse who'd first asked me to check on Mr. Whitmore. She'd heard about my leaving and wanted to share something that had been bothering her. Collins, you remember that night with the patient who heard the woman in distress, Mr. Whitmore? Of course. I've been thinking about it ever since. I've worked ICU for 8 years, and I've never seen anything like his certainty about another patient's condition. But here's what's been bothering me. I checked the architectural plans for our unit after you left. She paused and I waited. The wall between room 412 and room 418 isn't just soundproofed. There's a mechanical room between them, full of HVAC equipment and electrical systems. The noise level in that mechanical space runs about 65 decibels constantly. Even if the walls weren't designed to block sound, the ambient noise would make it impossible to hear anything from the other side. So you're confirming that what he described was impossible. I'm confirming that it was more impossible than we realized at the time. But Collins, here's the thing that really bothers me. Last month we had another patient in room 412. Different person, similar age, admitted for routine observation. Around 2 a.m., he started insisting he could hear someone calling for help from down the hall. My heart started racing. What happened? Room 417 this time. Patient went into cardiac arrest about 10 minutes after our patient started reporting the distress calls. We responded immediately and saved her life. Did you document it? I tried, but administration classified it as coincidental. Said the patient might have heard normal ICU sounds and misinterpreted them as distress. They don't want staff attributing medical intuition to patients who aren't medically trained. After the call ended, I sat in my living room thinking about room 412. Two different patients, months apart, both reporting distress calls from other ICU rooms, both providing accurate information that led to life-saving interventions. It wasn't about the patients, it was about the location. I spent the following weeks researching the history of Mercy General, particularly the fourth floor ICU. The original building plans from 1923 showed that area had housed the hospital's first intensive care ward. In 1967, the space had been completely renovated, following a series of patient deaths that had been attributed to inadequate monitoring equipment. But what caught my attention was a note in the renovation records. Replace acoustic dampening in rooms 410 to 415, following persistent reports of phantom sounds interfering with patient rest. Phantom sounds in 1967. I found similar notes scattered through decades of maintenance records, HVAC modifications to address unusual sound transmission patterns on the fourth floor, electrical system upgrades to eliminate auditory disturbances that were affecting patient recovery, multiple references to acoustic issues that the engineering reports couldn't adequately explain or resolve. The patterns suggested that room 412, and possibly other rooms in that section, had been experiencing acoustic anomalies for over 50 years. But the recent cases weren't about hearing actual sounds. They were about patients somehow becoming aware of medical emergencies in other locations through means that had no scientific explanation. I never found answers that satisfied my need to understand what I'd witnessed, but I've continued to document cases when they come to my attention, building a database of impossible events that medical institutions prefer not to acknowledge. The patients who experience these episodes aren't psychotic or attention-seeking. They're ordinary people who suddenly find themselves aware of medical distresses they couldn't possibly know about. They provide specific, accurate information that leads to life-saving interventions. And when emergency responders arrive to help the person in distress, the voices they're hearing always stop. I've come to believe that there are aspects of human awareness and medical emergency response that we don't understand and aren't equipped to study within current scientific frameworks. Certain people, under specific circumstances, seem to become aware of others' medical distress in ways that transcend normal sensory perception. The healthcare system isn't prepared to acknowledge or integrate this phenomenon. It challenges too many fundamental assumptions about patient monitoring, emergency response, and the nature of human perception itself. It's easier to classify these cases as psychiatric symptoms than to confront the possibility that our understanding of medical emergency awareness is incomplete. But the patients saved by these impossible interventions are still alive. Mrs. Chen, Mr. Kowalski, Baby Johnson, and others whose names I may never know. Their survival stands as evidence that something real was happening, regardless of our ability to explain or accept it. I think about the other security officers, nurses, and medical staff who've encountered similar cases over the years. How many dismissed them as coincidental? How many patients were sedated or transferred to psychiatric evaluation because they provided accurate information about medical emergencies they couldn't have known about? In 14 years of hospital security, I learned to distinguish between genuine distress and attention-seeking behavior, between medical emergencies and false alarms, between rational concerns and delusional thinking. The patients who heard impossible voices fell into none of those familiar categories. They were experiencing something real that happened to be impossible. I resigned because I couldn't continue working in an environment that required me to ignore evidence of something that might save lives, simply because it didn't fit established medical understanding. Sometimes late at night, I wonder if there are patients in hospitals across the country trying to tell medical staff about emergencies they're somehow aware of, only to be dismissed as delusional because their knowledge is medically impossible. And I wonder how many people have died alone because no one was willing to listen to the impossible voices that knew they needed help. If you enjoyed this story, you'll love what's coming next. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it.